Hello, welcome. It's Francis here. Thank you for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I bid thee welcome. Please subscribe to show your support. And there's also a bell if you want to be notified as to when I upload more content. I'm coming to you from Kaurna country here on the Adelaide Plains, and as such I acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of this land and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So this video is just going to be sort of sharing a few thoughts on initiation, what initiation is, from a historical perspective, sort of, but also from a contemporary witchcraft perspective, because these words seem to go in cycles, and at the moment, initiation's appearing on my feed again. So, according to the dictionary, initiation has two meanings. The first is the action of admitting someone into a secret or obscure society or group, typically with a ritual. The second meaning is the action of beginning something, and they usually appear in that order. So initiation is generally considered to be a rite of passage, marking the entrance or acceptance into a group or society. It can be a formal admission into, say, adulthood by the community, or one of its formal components. And in the extended sense, it can also signify the transformation of the initiate, where they are reborn into the new role, or a new role. So historian Mircea Eliade, I think that's how you pronounce his name, I'm not 100% sure, defined initiation as a basic change in the existential condition, which liberates man, or human being, from the profound time and history. He also went on to state that initiation recapitulates the sacred history of the world, and through this recapitulation, the whole world is sanctified anew. The initiate can then perceive the world as a sacred world, a sacred work, and the creation of God, God's divine whatever. So there are a number of forms of initiation. We have life initiations. Various cultures, as I said, undertake specific puberty rites that mark the transition from childhood or adolescence through into adulthood. These rites represent above all the revelation of the sacred. Then there are initiations that are undertaken when entering secret societies, such as the Freemasons, and also initiations undertaken by those people who are entering into a mystical vocation, such as becoming a shaman. And these are limited to such people who are considered to be destined to participate in a more intense religious experience than is accessible to the rest of the community. So that sort of goes against, I know, the Western perception that these days that everybody wants to be a shaman and everybody thinks that they have the right to undertake a lot of these sacred teachings and trainings, and without them actually being truly properly prepared mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or even understanding that not everybody has access to these things. But up for debate, but we won't go down that can of worms. So within contemporary witchcraft, initiation is considered to be a spiritual rite where the individual is plugged in, so to speak, to the current or the essence of that tradition. It's an act that opens the initiate up to having a greater exposure to the mysteries of that tradition, the revelation, developing a deeper understanding or insight into secrets held within the mysteries that are pertaining to that tradition. So this is a similar belief within other forms or traditions. In particular, I'm thinking of energetic healings such as Reiki, where you have to go though it's like an attunement, is actually a sense of initiation that plugs you into that current where you get the symbols and also plugs you into that lineage, i.e. the people who have formed part of your teachings, which can then be used as a form of validation, which again seems to be very important these days, because there are a lot of people offering Reiki, or what they say is Reiki. Should I say shortened versions, whitewashed versions? I've done a video on Reiki, and yeah, it still comes up and annoys me that you can become a Reiki master within a weekend, going from Reiki 1 to Reiki master. That's not how it's supposed to work when you're talking about energetic healings, but that's another rabbit hole. Let's stick to initiation. So initiation rites are not new or limited to contemporary witchcraft. One of the more famous historical examples are the Ellucian Mysteries that took place in ancient Greece, and which are believed to date back to the Mircean period or the Bronze Age, which is around about 1500 BCE, according to some sources. I don't know, I wasn't there. And also we don't know much about these rites because they form part of a mystery cult. However, we do know that there were some aspects of these rites which were held publicly, while others which were held privately, and also at different times of the year, which tended to incorporate mythology surrounding Demeter or Demeter and Persephone. Within the context of contemporary witchcraft, as well as other esoteric groups, not to mention spiritual traditions such as Judaism, Sufism, forms of yoga, Buddhism, etc. Initiation is a key component because it is considered to cause a fundamental process and change to begin within the person being initiated, and its evolution operates within both the material world and the spiritual world. During the rite, the person who is actually conducting the initiation process, the initiator, transfers certain powers or states of being into the initiate. And it is this transference, this awakening, which is often likened to the simultaneous death and rebirth process. Death as in death of the old self, the old ways of being, the old ways of thinking, and rebirth of the new. Due to this transformation, the initiation is not something that should be undertaken lightly because you just want to belong to a club, and also something that should not be taken on whim. In all of these cases, initiation is seen as being initiated into something, i.e. a tradition, a group, a lineage. So just for the records, putting it out there, so to speak, of course, there are other forms of initiations, as I mentioned right at the beginning. Life can initiate us through different experiences, puberty, as mentioned earlier, motherhood, death, or experiencing death of a close one or a loved one. However, these are not always the same as initiation into, say, a mystery cult or a religion or a spiritual path. And this is what I'm talking about here. Not because they're any less or more relevant, just because they are different and the whole circumstances is different. Because one has to be initiated into a group, this dismisses the modern concept that a person can self-initiate, at least in my perspective or in the perspective of contemporary or initiatory witchcraft, etc. What you can do on your own is self-dedicate. So therefore, within my tradition, and I'm just checking to see if I've got a book here that I'm about to talk about, there's no such thing as self-initiation. I know this is a concept that some people talk about, or some authors, more recent times, talk about, but within more traditional witchcraft traditions, and I'm listening, they're going, well, when you say traditional witchcraft, again, this comes up with different labels. what I'm talking about, initiatory witchcraft in particular, there's no such thing as self-initiation. However, this does not mean that you can't self-initiate. If you are a solitary, you can do whatever you want to do. However, my tradition does not acknowledge self-initiation, because through this particular lens of witchcraft, in particular I look through, as stated above, you need to be initiated into something. And at the end of the day, this perception is not up for debate. So to be initiated into contemporary witchcraft means that you need to be part of a coven and be initiated into that tradition, and still be initiated into one that adheres to the rites and the ethics, etc. of that tradition. Added to this, it also means that if you are initiated into a stream of initiatory witchcraft and find yourself at a later stage not involved in a working group, then technically you're not able to perform the rituals from the Book of Shadows. This is because the rituals, or traditional rituals in the Book of Shadows, are specifically geared around a working group. It does not mean, however, that you cannot perform the rituals at all. You can modify them, but they sort of lose their authenticity, so to speak, and then there's big debates or question marks as to how plugged into that current you are. So someone like myself, who lives in another hemisphere from when our book originated, it has caused a few issues in the past. Any modifications or alterations, changes I personally make, I make sure that these are noted, and there's usually a sort of a explanation as to why. But these days there's a general consensus across the board of the differences between the hemispheres, and the acknowledgement that Southern Hemisphere initiates do work in accordance to the energies of the Southern Hemisphere. Yeah. Now it comes down to the appropriateness and how plugged into the current you actually are. Now, some people may call this gatekeeping, which is another term that gets bounded about, sometimes in a positive sense, or more accurate sense, sometimes by people simply because they cannot get access to what they want. Is it, sort of sits on the fence in relation to this. Sometimes I feel it is important to gatekeep, depending on the context, especially if you're wanting to keep the lineage teachings as pure as possible. We have seen over the decades, when information gets out to the wider public, people who aren't initiated into that lineage don't actually understand the unwritten connections behind such teachings, and therefore its interpretation changes. And we've seen this in instances such as the Wiccan Read, which still these days, 30 years after it, or 40 years after it was first made public, the misinterpretations around it and what it actually means still continue. And the negativity towards Wiccans, or anybody calling themselves Wiccans, because of this misinterpretation, again, still continues much at large in the wider pagan witchcraft community. So in such instances, gatekeeping, if you want to call it, is essential to sort of keep these teachings pure in their pure forms. And I said any additions or changes need to be noted. I also feel that using the word gatekeeping sometimes is almost an attempt to project guilt onto other people when we can't get what we want, even if we don't truly understand what it is that we have set our sights on. And I suppose this is another can of worms we can dive into. Everyone's got their 2 cents with, and it's just like, yeah, I feel at times there is has to be things that are closed, and not everything is as inclusive as people like it to be. It just simply can't. There's a lot of logic behind that, but as I said, that's another can of worms. Getting back to initiation. Now, one of the books, and mine is an older copy, that I find very beneficial for beginners or people who are interested in more contemporary initiatory witchcraft, regardless of whether you actually belong to a coven or not. My copy is a bit dated, is Vivian Crowley's Wicca, the Old Religion for a New Age. I know I've referred it to in other videos. It's called Wicca, the Old Religion for a New Millennium, or something like that. It's got sort of a maroon or cerise cover now, pinky cover onto it. But I like it because I think Vivian speaks my language, in that she's a psychoanalyst or a psychologist, and she actually explains a lot of the behind-the-scenes concepts. And in this book, she states that initiation is a form of spiritual awakening that also links the initiate to the group or the group consciousness, the egregore of that group, that tradition. And this latter point is important because within contemporary witchcraft, every coven is run autonomously, independent of each other, but you are connected into this current on a wider scheme of things. As I mentioned earlier, very similar to if you get an authentic initiation or attunement into Reiki. She also mentions that the concept of self-initiation tends to contradict this, because you are not initiating into a coven or a group, you're not initiating into a tradition, and I've all said to this. And while there may be a form of spiritual awakening, this is very personal, and no one, aside from the individual, can really determine or explain what has actually happened to you. So this is despite all the posts that you see on the social medias feeds, asking, what does this mean? What does that mean? No one knows except for you. You know what you've studied, you know what you've gone through, you know the situations and the circumstances surrounding your experience. Crowley, and I like this, also goes on to state that it's important to remember or keep in mind that when practicing contemporary witchcraft, for the most part, as with other forms of magic, it actually causes spiritual and psychological changes within the practitioner, and as such, self-initiation is rather like removing one's appendix. While it can be undertaken, but in all honesty, surely at a last resort option. Let me repeat that. Vivian Crowley considers that self-initiation is rather like removing one's own appendix. So it can be done, but surely as a last resort option. And the reason behind this, and this is what I like about her book, because she gives all this background information, is it is difficult to guide ourselves through the initiatory stages of spiritual development without someone or anyone to whom we can turn to objective advice or encouragement. Today, people seem to feel that it's necessary to turn to social media, and the problem with this is that they are getting complete strangers to share their 2 cents with on things that such people may or may not actually know anything about. Or they may not know anything about the querent's training, knowledge base, the direction they desire to head in, their backstory, where they get this information from, anything. And I see this over and over again, the numerous times rather flippant comments such as, do whatever you want to do, whatever feels good for you, given, which can actually be spiritually, if not psychologically damaging, if you have no idea of what the querent has undertaken the source of their knowledge and their own personal experience, including psychological state, mental state, emotional state, etc., etc., etc. So if you're working solitary and gathering information from various sources, only you know what you know. If you are involved with a group whose training is shared, then even through individual experiences and individual results, because everybody will experience things differently, at least there is a common connection or understanding of a knowledge base that can then be built upon. For a solitary, it very much comes down to discernment, self-responsibility, and, dare I say, maturity. Do not believe everything that is posted on social media, or that you read in a blog or in a book, even a book by elders. Do your own research. Read and form a knowledge base first before you rush out and try. At the end of the day, magic is not for everyone. Witchcraft is not for everyone. Nor should it be used as a quick fix solution, especially when there can very well be deeper and even more complex underlying issues that need to be dealt with. Now, I do realise that I'm probably coming from a little bit more of an old-fashioned perspective, but I feel it is very important to have a foundation first before you head into some of the practices that I see on the socials. But that's just my 2 cents worth, and that's probably another can of worms to go down at another stage. I do have some more notes, but I might do a separate video because I'm already over the 20-minute mark. So that's enough from me on initiation. Just because you're a solitary or you got no one near you doesn't mean that you can't work. It's just that I suppose the onus comes more down to you taking responsibility and trusting your own self, as opposed to this reliance on other people, especially strangers who you do not know. But I'll talk a little bit more about that at a later stage. So, blessings.